Welcome to Case by Case, a deeper dive into the popular True Crime Arizona podcast. Our focus this episode, the Sleepwalker Murderer. I'm your host, Chris Pickle, joining you for a discussion with the journalists behind the True Crime Arizona podcast, reporter Briana Whitney, producer Serjio Hernandez.
Thank you so much for interviewing us about this. It is really cool to talk about.
Interviewing you about the cases that you have researched, because your podcasts are so informative and compelling, and there's just so much more to talk about with all the research that you have both done on these. So let's jump right into it. The name itself, the Sleepwalker Murderer, that just draws you in. But let's go over the key points of the crime and of the defense, because that's what made national news when this happened. But first, let's go over the details of the crime.
Right. So kind of a summary here. Scott Falater lived in Phoenix. He worked at Motorola. Family man from what people described. And then on this night, neighbors hear his wife Yarmila screaming, and they come out to look what's going on. Scott is stabbing her 44 times and then dragged her into the pool, then went upstairs, got rid of his clothes, had a knife. He went and then stashed that into his car. And once police got to the scene, he told them that he suffered from a sleep disorder and that he was sleepwalking during the entire thing, could not remember murdering his wife.
So that is what really made national news when this happened, and why it became such big news, because he genuinely claimed the defense was he slept through all this.
Correct. And that's unbelievable to think, right? When you 44 times, I mean, what? You're thinking, wouldn't her screaming wake him up? I mean, the whole situation is hard to imagine actually unfolding and somebody being asleep through the entire situation. So yes, it gained national, international headlines and interest, because people were like, how could somebody seriously claim they were asleep while they killed their wife like this?
And held her underwater in the pool.
Yes, which he originally went out that night to fix the pool pump. And then he told investigators that when she came outside, he was asleep when he walked out, and then he stabbed her.
And the neighbors were witnessing this crime?
Yes. So from our research, and actually our old coverage too from Channel 3, the neighbor, Greg Coons, and his girlfriend heard the screaming, heard what was going on. So they came out to watch what was going on over the fence and saw this play out. They heard it play out, and then they called 911.
So there was never any doubt that he committed the crime. There was never no, it wasn't me. There were witnesses, and he accepted it, that this was me, but I was asleep.
Right. So it was never a whodunit, right? We knew he did it. He knew he did it. The trial ended up becoming about whether the jurors would think that he should get a first-degree murder charge or a lesser charge, because first-degree murder, you would have intent to kill, and he and his defense team were basically laying out the fact that he did not intend to kill. He didn't recall killing.
And that brings up the point of motivation. So often, crimes are about the people, the motivation. In your research, what did you learn about the relationship between Scott Falater and his wife?
From what we learned, talking to his friend, going back through the tapes of interviews, he really was a family man. I mean, this seemed to really shock the community and the people that knew him. They were a Mormon family. He was a devout church leader. He talked about his kids lovingly a lot. He talked about Yarmila lovingly. I mean, it wasn't one of those things where people were like, oh, we saw this coming. No, people were genuinely shocked that something like this could happen with this family.
So listening to the podcast, you both take us back in time to this trial. We hear a lot of the actual testimony from this trial, and this was 20 years ago. How did you get all this footage?
We have these archives that we can actually go back and research these and see everything that happened. I mean, for a case like this, because it was so unusual. I mean, every station covered it. We covered it constantly. I was actually a live truck operator when this was happening, so I sat in the truck as this was being fed to us, listening to everything. at the time being a little bored, but listening to the case as it goes on, listening to every little thing that they're talking about, it was really just interesting. And so as I went back into the archives, as we went back into the archives and pulled all these tapes and kind of looked through, it gave you a real feeling of how entertaining this was for everybody. Because it was something you never heard of before.
A spectacle.
A spectacle, exactly.
And also interesting, people might think we have everything digitally.
That's what I was going to bring up.
Digitally stored now, but we don't. We have some of it digitally stored, but a lot of our old footage is in what we call the morgue, or we call the vault, whatever you want to call it. It's just this room in our station of tapes and tapes and tapes and tapes of footage and old crime stories and old stories, everything we covered. 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s as well. And so we had to go through and find all of these tapes. And it's interesting. I mean, the O.J. Simpson case was going on through some of this as well. So we kept seeing parts of that when we were looking for this information too. So it's just very interesting to go almost back in time with technology too, and find these tapes and physically put them in and have to rewind them and fast forward. And these are words we don't use anymore.
And I admit, I have not been in our morgue. Is it like other stations where you physically take a tape off the shelf, open it up, look at a piece of paper, and see what is written down to be on that tape, and then you have to fast forward and rewind and look for it that way?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what it's like. And to our frustration, some of the people that worked back then weren't as detailed in their description. So you would see murder,
pool murder,
just different little words, and you'd have to be like, okay, I'm going to pull this tape. Dozens of tapes later, you have to go through each one of them, scroll to where that time code is, see if that's even this case. And a lot of the times it wasn't. It just so happens that around the same time, I think 2 other pool accidents happened, and one of them was a car into a pool. So I kept going back and just kind of.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, when they say you have to do some legwork on a story as a journalist, you guys were actually doing that, spending hours doing this.
I said it was like a library. We were up on the ladder looking up all these tapes. It's almost like, you see those pictures when they're getting books up from the top shelf. And that's how we felt when we were going in there looking at this. But I actually found it so interesting. Just, I was really young when this happened. So for me to be able to go back and see this kind of preserved in our station, as well as just kind of Arizona history, I found it really interesting.
I also thought it was interesting too, as from a photojournalist standpoint, you can see the progression of the tapes evolve from this style of beta tape to this style of beta tape to DVC.
We could nerd out. It's like, is it VHS? Is it beta? Is it M2?
I don't even know what a beta tape is. I learned that. So
we'll do the entry. Something that was used decades ago.
Right. Goes to show you how old the case is.
So in talking about going through all these tapes, and you watched the trial, when it was coming down to it, did it basically seem in the trial that it came down to the battle of the sleep experts? Because you had it on both experts on the prosecution and the defense side.
Yeah, that was super interesting to see. And they were well-renowned sleep experts on both sides. It kind of seemed like whatever attorney got to whatever sleep expert to say, hey, say this or focus on this to help our side is what happened. But it did really seem to come down to that. And that seemed to be what the audience also honed in on as well is, well, could he have been asleep? Could that be a situation? And that's really what captivated a lot of people.
When we interviewed the judge, I thought it was interesting that he actually said he was very interested in the defense. And so was all the other lawyers and people that are involved in the legal process. They were interested in the defense because it was just so outlandish.
Well, one of the things that caught me in that podcast was when you interviewed the judge, he had his notes from 20 years ago. Did he tell you why he kept those notes?
Yeah, so Ron Reinstein was the judge, and he presided over a lot of huge capital murder cases, other murder cases. And for him, it was just about kind of storing these big cases that he had worked on, almost preserving those memories in time. And he also thought because he was working on such large cases that you never know when an appeal could come up or there could be new evidence in something. So he wanted to make sure he saved what he had. So he has notes on quite a few cases because he was a very important judge at the time, and he was presiding over these huge cases that would determine somebody's life. And so, yeah, he saved it all.
And he knew even at that time how big this case was just because of the type of defense that was being presented.
Right.
All right. So you had these sleep specialists from back in the day testifying on both sides. And you did something a little extra for your podcast, because we all know that information can change over the years. You get new data, new studies. So you took the information to a sleep specialist recently.
Right.
When you laid out all the information, was there anything that she said, yeah, this could happen, this could be a real defense?
Yes and no. I loved that interview with her because it gives you insight into what really can happen when you're sleepwalking or have a sleep disorder. So when we laid it all out with her, she says she does believe that he has a sleep disorder and does believe that the night began with him sleepwalking. You can go outside, you can do that. And truly, when you are sleepwalking, you do not have conscious memory of that. He did likely go outside to try to fix the pool pump. She believes that he started out asleep, even maybe doing the stabbing too, because you can have intentional movements when you're in a sleepwalking stage or trance. Her issue with the case is that usually a sleepwalking episode does not last longer than 20 minutes. And there's about 40 to 50 minutes of time that Scott is claiming he doesn't remember. And Lori said, you just don't see that. She says she doesn't believe that there is a possibility that he could do everything he did in this long amount of time. And
but she says it may have started off as sleepwalking and then progressed to something else?
So to account for that, she says starts as sleepwalking. He wakes up in the middle of it. She believes he panicked and then started, stashing the clothes and trying to almost rid himself of what he had done. So does she believe it's possible he could have been asleep through the whole thing? Yes. Probable? No.
I think she also mentioned the noises of murdering someone, the screams from the wife. Usually loud noises are going to wake somebody up, or jostling around too much is going to wake someone up.
So you can wake somebody up out of a sleepwalking episode.
Yeah, I also think she mentioned it's kind of a misnomer that you shouldn't wake someone up from sleepwalking.
Well, there had been other instances recorded of his sleepwalking with his sister.
Yeah, so she testified in court that when they were younger, probably 20 years prior, that he had been sleepwalking into the kitchen. She was down there already, and that she accidentally kind of just brushed up against him, and that when she did that, he turned around and kind of threw her. And that,
so there was violence in that.
Correct. That he had a violent past of sleepwalking. But she also testified that they had this loving relationship, Yarmila and Scott. So her point in testifying was that he did have a disorder. But a lot of friends did not know that he struggled with any sort of sleep issues.
Would you know if any of your friends struggle with
That's
sleepwalking?
I don't know.
I've never talked to anybody I work with about that, but that's an interesting point. And to have that, this wasn't a one-time thing, that his sister established that he did have the sleepwalking. Mm-hmm. Something else in the trial I thought was interesting. You guys, in your story, interviewed a woman who worked with Scott. She said she couldn't believe he was a killer. That was a hard thing for her to really come to grips with. But she said working with him, he was under a lot of stress. There was something really small in the podcast, but I thought it was interesting. This was 20 years ago, and she was willing to talk to you, but she still did not want her name used. She didn't want to be identified. Why did she, after all this time, still not want to be connected to this case?
She had told me that it was such a controversial case at the time. People have their opinions on both sides. And she didn't want to have people reaching back out to her about this after it, almost reopening the can of worms of having to defend what she believes happened and what she heard. And so she, just for her own sanity and life, family life, didn't want to be contacted by a bunch of people after the case aired. And so that's why she stayed anonymous.
That's interesting that it would have been such a dark time not wanting to relive that and go through that again, but that's very understandable. In your research, has the sleepwalking defense ever worked that you know of?
Yes, there was a case in Canada, and that was brought up in the trial too, where I believe that person did successfully use the sleepwalking defense. But I don't know of any other cases besides that. And because it is such a rare situation or defense, that's why it gained so much popularity. But I do believe that Scott and his team knew about this Canada case, and so believe that would help them in the trial.
So they had something prior to this. Any cases that you know of since this case where it has worked?
I don't even know a case where that was a defense since this. No, not to my knowledge. No. Sergio, do you know any?
No, and I also think that Canada case, there wasn't so many extenuating circumstances in it. I think it was pretty cut and dry. There wasn't 44
right
stab wounds, attempted drowning, an act of trying to hide the evidence, and it was just kind of more of a cut and dry case, if I remember right.
Yeah, so many aspects to this actual murder. The judge sentenced Scott to natural life in prison so that he could have a relationship with his kids. That's what the judge told you. They had lost their mother. He didn't want the kids to lose their father also. So those kids would be adults now. Do you know if they do have a relationship with their father?
I know somewhat, yes. And the only reason I know that is because I searched and tried to find his kids to do an interview with them for the story. And I did make contact with Michael. That was his son. And when I asked Michael if he'd be willing to do an interview of some sort, he said he wasn't sure he would think about it, but he needed to ask his dad if he was okay with it and if his dad would want to talk too. Michael eventually got back to me and said they both did not want to talk about the case. So there has to be some sort of communication there. But to what extent, I don't know.
So it's always important to remember when we're talking about things like murder, cases like this aren't just about the victim and the killer. There are so many people whose lives are impacted and just changed forever. And in this case, it was the kids who end up growing up. These kids had to grow up without either of their parents.
And they were teenagers at the time, I believe. I think they were 12 and 15 or 13 and 15. So they were young. And in talking to Judge Reinstein too, he said the kids believed their dad, that they had seen a loving relationship too. There was just really no signs. And that's where people really got stuck was, well, maybe he is telling the truth because he didn't have a motive and there was no reason why he would have killed her. But something I found interesting is that, and this never happens nowadays, is that the jury ends up talking to TV cameras right after the verdict. All of them did go with first-degree murder, and the reason they did was they just couldn't believe that he would drag the body to the pool and go upstairs and stash the clothes and quiet the dog and come back down without being awake. They just did not believe that in that amount of time and for how intentional the acts were, that he could be asleep that whole time. And so ultimately the jury was not persuaded by the family testimony or, they were this perfect family. They didn't buy it. They truly believed that he meant to kill her. And so I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It's the way they brought out each juror going through the files. And we didn't use a lot of it in our podcast because some of it just didn't fit with the way the story went. But they brought out each juror and they let the media just question them and ask them anything they wanted. And each juror was very, very forthcoming. I mean, they told how they felt about Scott Falater. Some of them seemed actually angry. Some of them seemed just surprised that this case got this far.
When you say got this far, that they were trying to actually use the sleepwalking as a defense? That it could even be believable?
That it could be believable, that it had so much interest, that it had so much back and forth between, like you said, sleepwalking experts. It seemed to me, maybe looking into this a little bit too much, it seemed to me that some of them were surprised that it became such a big circus of a case, so much media coverage, so many back and forth between experts and so many people just speculating on what happened.
And even Scott took the stand himself. I found that to be crazy as well. I mean, he described his stressful work situation, and some of the sleep experts testified that that could have sprung a sleep disorder or an episode. And so that was kind of used as well. But he over and over said he never had the intention to kill her. You know, that would never have been his thought. And he was almost bewildered when he came to the realization that it was him because there was blood on his clothes.
What was his demeanor on the stand when he was talking?
He did get emotional once, but for the most part, it was pretty subdued. I felt like it was just almost a little more matter of fact.
I was thinking about that while I was putting this together. There was a moment when he did get emotional, sad about killing her when he was describing it. But for the most part, my takeaway was he seemed very, I wouldn't say cold, more like just stoic, not having a lot of emotion about this, even when he was reiterating what he was told happened. Because his verbiage, he had to kind of dance around because he was admitting to the murder, but not admitting to
fault. It's like,
Yeah.
I killed her, but it's not my fault because I was asleep.
Yeah, so
Right.
between the legal verbiage that he had to use, I'm sure he was coached by his attorney, and the way it came out, it just seemed very
Almost disconnected from what happened.
Yeah.
I found it to be like he was just almost recalling these events that he wasn't a part of, but that he was. Not overly animated, not overly charismatic, not overly emotional. He did get emotional, but really only at the part when he describes realizing that he had done it, almost as if I couldn't even believe that I could be capable of something like that. His time on the stand it wouldn't have swayed me one way or another. Did he show a lot of remorse? I wouldn't say so, but he
agree.
seemed sorry, but a little too casual. I thought it was a little casual.
Yeah,
He never
I
meant
agree.
to, but that, he's sorry it happened.
Did you guys go to the house?
No.
I went to the house years ago when I started. Like you said, this happened 20 years ago, and I was just starting my journey into journalism. So yeah, I've been to the house, but it was decades ago.
When you went there, even though it was decades ago, was it just like middle suburbia? You go there. What was your feelings when you were at the house looking to? This is where a violent crime happened, a murder, and with what many people could say the most outlandish excuse or alibi behind it.
It was just middle suburbia. The neighbors were very nice. They talked to reporters. I don't remember personally interviewing them, but I do remember other reporters doing it. They were very nice and forthcoming. Yeah, this was a nice couple, nice family. They did all the things you would think a normal family in suburbia would do.
When you guys were going through the tapes, was there anything else that stood out to you that you just didn't have time to put in the podcast? It didn't make its way into the podcast?
You know what? I can't think of anything that we left out. That's one of the benefits of doing these podcasts and actually having the time to put one of these long format stories together is that you can add in almost everything. You can put almost anything you want into it because you don't have a time
limit. Yeah. So anything that we don't get to put into our TV case episodes, we get to then put into the podcast. So we always like that we have this medium, if you could say, to be able to really dive deep into these cases and really present everything that we've found or that was recorded. It brings people in when we can include more of the interviews and the conversations and the tape recordings. And we love that we get to be able to do that over a podcast format.
Well, definitely a fascinating case. And when you look at it, unique.
Yes. And as a listener, you listen to our podcast. Do you think he was asleep?
I think when you go back and listen to it, it is that you would have to suspend belief that somebody could get into a pool and just the shock of the water not wake them up. And obviously, it was a defense that did not work in this case.
When I interviewed the sleep expert, I feel like I agree with her based on all the evidence that he started out asleep, especially since he had a history of sleeping disorders and issues, but that he did wake up during it, panicked, and then tried to do what he could to cover up what he could and go from there. I don't think he was asleep that long either. That's just a long chunk of time to be unaccounted for when you're doing that intentional of activities.
And the judge and jury did not believe that either.
They didn't either.
I agree.
Sergio?
I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I think he might have been asleep and maybe did sleepwalk, but to stab someone 44 times, that is time consuming. It's not just a violent act and a jarring act to your body to do it, because I would assume he had to hold her down. So that means one hand holding her down, the other one stabbing her, and to do it 44 times, it is time consuming. I mean, just count to 45 seconds, and that's how long it would take, even if you're a fast person. I mean, that's just a long time to be brutally murdering someone and not waking up.
Well, you guys have picked some very interesting and unique cases for True Crime Arizona. We look forward to hearing more background behind these podcasts and having these discussions. On behalf of Briana, Sergio, and myself, thank you for joining us for this episode of Case by Case, a discussion of the True Crime Arizona podcasts.